Welcome to Farm Your Daily, a field-forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Your Daily, beef demand has been defying market principles. We chat with Mike Anderson with the Iowa Beef Industry Council about why that may be. Then, corn prices are below the cost of production, how that works with Reese Drenth of the Ground Level Dispatch. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Your Daily. And joining me on Farm Your Daily, we're going to go over a topic that is recently being a bit more pronounced, the beef market, which has seen record high prices, record low inventory, and yet demand is still strong. And we're going to cover that with Mike Anderson, Executive Director of the Iowa Beef Industry Council. Mike, thank you so much for joining us on Farm Your Daily, and let's dive into that. How is beef really, I guess, going against the grain when it comes to your typical knowledge when it comes to the marketplace of supply and demand?
Yeah, David, it's first of all, thank you for having me today on your podcast. I'm glad to be here and speak on this topic. It's kind of picked up some steam, it seems like, here recently, whereas prices have been high for 2-3 years now, both on the market side and then kind of at the consumer retail grocery store chain as well. Well, as you mentioned, kind of the supply and demand. We are at kind of a record low cow herd inventory here across the whole U.S. as far as the supply goes. And I think as you look at demand, the biggest factor that I would see that attributes to that is our quality of product. There's some other things too, but you look at our cattle market today, and we've got well over 85% of our cattle going to market that are grading that choice or higher quality grades. We think of quality grades as choice and prime, or the upper kind of echelon products. They get a lot of that internal marbling fat in there for flavor and things like that. So I think the quality of product that our producers are making really is a huge and the biggest testament for folks and consumers wanting that, whether it's a thick, juicy hamburger or high quality steak or some of those other cuts. To me, that's been a huge factor. But also I think the nutrition platform as well. We're kind of in a generation now, the younger generation especially, kind of a healthier diet. And I think in the past, beef has gotten kind of a reputation kind of off and on as far as, is it a good red meat to consume? And so I think there's been a lot of research studies done, independent studies nationally, on the nutrition benefits of beef and as part of a heart healthy diet. And so I think that's a big thing too, that the younger generation is wanting to eat healthy, packed protein diets, whether it's protein shakes, but they may not want those every meal, every day. So looking for protein sources that can fulfill that need as well.
That's a really interesting angle to take it. It makes sense now that you say it, but I wasn't quite expecting it because the idea of making it so beef is more valuable and higher quality makes sense. But I recall beef for a lot of my life as something that is on the cheaper side. You're supposed to have it for your fast food hamburgers, for your hamburger helper. I made some lasagnas for a family and then my own family the other day that required a couple pounds of ground beef. That's kind of the normal expectation that I have. And you're saying there's been kind of a cultural shift amid this time to have this higher value aspect of it as well.
Yeah, in a sense, you talk about ground beef, that obviously is far and away the most popular, product that folks use, like you said, grilling hamburgers, or if it's ground beef in a certain recipe. And you think of prices right now at grocery stores are hovering around that, $6 per pound for ground beef. And you look at that and you think, wow, that's gone up quite a bit. But as you look at other products, as we talk about inflation, whether it's potato chips or cereal or milk or any of those products, when you go to the grocery store, you're paying a lot more for all of that in general for food products as we go grocery shopping. So as you look at ground beef, for example, if you're feeding a family of 4 with a pound of hamburger, figure like a quarter pounder per person, that $6, isn't relatively that expensive as you look at other products inflation as well. So I think that's kind of one thing that maybe we've lost track of. I think beef, it's kind of been latched onto from media outlets as far as the increase in price. But I think if you look at other products as well, they've gone up in that realm too. But as you mentioned, yeah, the higher quality, your ribeye steaks or New York strips and some of those higher quality products, I think, yeah, consumers are looking for those products, and we've got some programs and some partnerships that we're doing with some folks here on the Iowa State campus with the Meat Lab, trying to look at some kind of underutilized cuts on that beef carcass where folks may not think of a typical steak or a cut from that carcass where they could use that's a little bit cheaper at the grocery store.
Now, this may be a bit of a tangent, but something I think of as well could be less of having less demand when it comes to the consumer side, but maybe less demand when it comes to the restaurant side. Because I am thinking of a specific example of when my brother in law was visiting a steakhouse that he really enjoyed, and he was eating it, and he's like, "This is good, but I think I could make much more of this at home." And so you have a potential there of removing that other aspect of the industry where people may be buying it to cook themselves as opposed to ordering it at a restaurant.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, like we all say, COVID changed a lot of things for a lot of aspects of our lives back in 2020. But I think that really one of the biggest things was folks, not being able to go anywhere pretty much and having to cook their own meals. And so I think that really turned um, things in a different direction where families are eating in their house more and cooking recipes and things like that. And so, you can buy a ribeye steak, say it's, 16, $18 at a grocery store, which seems like a lot for a steak, but you go out to a dining experience and you get all the rest of the stuff, you're turning into, almost a $50 or more per plate
Easily.
things. And so I think that's been one of the I suppose positive things to come out of COVID was that folks are wanting to learn more where their meat comes from, how their food is produced. It not doesn't just show up at the grocery store. So we've been trying to tell our story of farmers and how they produce the food, and then giving those consumers some recipe ideas for, as I said, those underutilized cuts. Like the tri-tip, for example, is one that we're using with the Iowa Restaurant Association and our partnership with them in a cooking competition with chefs that will use that cut as far as a competition goes. So things like that. The chuck eye steak is one that folks don't think of a lot when they're looking for a steak. There's a one called a picanha, which if you go to Fairway Harvey, they'll know what that is. Or a Denver steak is one that's kind of,
That's a very common cut in Brazil. I have to say
yes,
that's a common Brazilian steak cut.
yes, exactly right. So some of those, and the Denver steak is kind of a newer one as well. So we've been trying to tout and push some of those more maybe not as familiar cuts with producers that can save some pennies at the grocery store, and then provide them with some recipe ideas for those cuts. They may not know, do I grill it, do I broil it, how do I prepare that particular cut, and then what can it go with and things like that. So
As just a quick interjection, tri-tip, especially as a kid, was one of my very favorite cuts of meat. And I grew up in California, and we moved back to Iowa when I was around, I think 8 or 9, my family could not find tri-tip anywhere. So it's funny you talk about that.
yes, yep, and I've seen it, yeah, at the meat counters here in town at Fairway and Hy-Vee and stuff. So, and a lot of that stuff, you can call ahead, and they'll be able to make those cuts for you as well. If it's something they don't have on hand, you can call ahead, and they'll have those cut up for you.
So my next question is going to involve kind of that inventory side because we do have record low inventory levels. However, the last cattle on feed report that came out did show Iowa grew in terms of its herd. And I guess the question will be a little twofold. What is causing that growth in this state? And uh, are there any impacts from some of this encouragement of local processors that we've had over the last 5, 10 years here in Iowa?
Yeah, I think as far as inventory goes, like you said, as far as U.S. market, we've got low cow numbers and low cow herd numbers. Um, But as you look at Iowa and our landscape and our feed sources, obviously we grow a lot of corn. So that's the number one feed source for cattle is corn. And so you look at some of the, especially the drought ridden areas down in Texas, out west, where they've had to sell off, massive numbers of cow herds due to drought. We haven't been faced nearly with that as those southern states have. And so I think a lot of those cattle that couldn't be finished out and fed down in Texas and some of those markets, naturally, they typically come up to Iowa, but even more so probably I think here in the last few years to get finished out and fed up here in Iowa. We also have, in Iowa, kind of the full spectrum of the cattle production cycles. So we've got cow calf producers that are raising those calves from birth, and then they're either selling them as feeder calves or they're retaining ownership here in Iowa and feeding those cattle out. And so you look at kind of Kansas, maybe Texas, where there's more some of those either feedlots or cow calf or backgrounder type producers. Iowa here, we're kind of blessed with having kind of that full spectrum. So I think we've been able to withstand a lot of this current cycle and question marks of what's going to happen in the future, that we've kind of stayed pretty steady here as far as cattle numbers in our state.
And then on that processor side, have we seen some pretty good movement in terms of how our local producers are using the processors that have been set up over the last while here?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. You talk about processors. I think there's a couple things there. One, your local processing or meat lockers. There's been some more of those opening up, and I know there's been some grants provided by the Iowa Department of Ag to get some improvements for those folks to expand their the amount of cattle that they can handle. Back as I said, during COVID, everything was backed up and lockers had 1-2 year wait lists, and I think that's eased up a little bit. And I think as more of those are able to get started, that'll increase the availability for producers to take cattle and to get harvested locally. We have our Iowa local beef directory that we have on our Iowa Beef Council website that lists those producers that sell meat direct to consumer right off their farm. And so I think that's been one of the biggest things we've seen here in Iowa that's increased is folks wanting to buy locally from cattle producers. And so we try and offer that list to those that are interested in that market. And so I think, yeah, moving forward, it'll be interesting on both of those fronts if there's some more of those local meat lockers that open up to process those cattle as well.
Mike Anderson is the executive director of the Iowa Beef Industry Council, joining me on Farm Here Daily. Thank you so much for your time, Mike.
Thanks, David.
This is Farm Here Daily. We will have more conversations on the way, but first, let's take a look at the marketplace. There was some green on the board at the close for Thursday. December corn, a penny and 3/4 higher, 4.19 3/4. March, an increase of a penny and a half, 4.37 1/2. Soybeans in November, a penny and a half more at 10.33 even, with January rising a penny and a half as well at 10.51 1/2. Soybean meal in October, $2.50 a ton in the green, $280.10. Soybean oil in October, an increase of a tenth of a penny, 51.51 a pound. Wheat in December, 2.5 cents more, 5.19 1/2, with March rising 2 1/4 at 5.36. There was red on the board at the livestock market close on Thursday. October live cattle down $1.37, 236.95. December falling $1.70 at 238.55. Feeder cattle in September, $2.25 a hundredweight weaker at 359.82, with October falling $2.55 at 358.95. Lean hogs in October, $1.20 a hundredweight more at $95.02 a hundredweight, with December rising 17 cents at $87.30 a hundredweight. That is the Thursday market close. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at some market trends. And to do so, we have Reese Drenth with the Ground Level Dispatch. And Reese has been on quite often on Farm Here Daily. But for those who don't know, the Ground Level Dispatch breaks down the markets twice a day, and they give farmers the essential information they need on grain prices and input costs, helping them make smarter marketing decisions. And so, if you're interested in cutting through noise or knowing what is going on, you can go to groundleveldispatch.com and subscribe. We do have a month free trial on the link in the description of this podcast, so you can check that out. Reese Drenth is joining us with the Ground Level Dispatch. Thanks so much for your time. And Reese, the thing I was thinking about this week as we were going through the marketplace is the idea of corn sustainability. We have notes from national associations saying that it is well below the cost of production at the moment. So let's start there. What is the generalized understanding of that cost of production, and is that a little too low from what you see?
Yeah, thanks for having us, and great questions. Certainly, questions that is on the forefront of everybody's mind. Farmer, end user, lobbyist, politician, you name it. So, margins are pretty bad when it comes to growing corn. Why is that? Well, obviously, prices have suffered all summer, really since corn made its high back in February. Prices have suffered. So that's step one, obviously, what you can sell the corn for. And then through to a plethora of headwinds, the conflict in the Middle East, trade negotiations, lack of trade negotiations, tariffs, maybe some protectionism on folks who produce fertilizers that farmers in this country need to produce crops, like Chinese and phosphates, or Russian phosphates, Russian energy, natural gas, urea, you name it. All of the things that you bundle up and put into the ground, or the products like natural gas that are turned into nitrogen that you bundle up and put in the ground, everything costs more. And there isn't really an end in sight at the moment. So what you have, and I think, you've seen folks in the industry, write articles about it. We've definitely written several articles about input prices and how profitability to grow crops, not only this year, but next year, is struggling. Analysts all over have, taken input costs and put them in terms of how many bushels to the acre does it cost you for 1 unit of fertilizer, and they've never been higher. The last time we had fertilizer prices have been higher than this, but the last time they were this high, corn was also $5, $6, $7 a bushel. Now you have cash corn off the combine, in many cases below $4 a bushel. So profitability, when you have a situation like that, is certainly struggle. So where do we go from here? That's a great question. High prices. Yeah, high prices should cure high prices, right? If we're operating in a free market, what does that mean? It means that prices become too high, where guys look at they run the numbers with, whoever helps them run their operation, or their banker, or whoever. And they say, well, it's going to cost us too much to put on X amount of nitrogen this year. It's going to cost us too much to put on X amount of phosphorus this year. We have to cut back. Where can we cut back? And so that lack of demand should, hopefully tame prices down when it comes to inputs. And I will, give a caveat a little bit here, that John is definitely much more qualified to talk about this stuff than I am, being that his whole career has been in the fertilizer market. But what we haven't seen so far in the nitrogen marketplace anyway is a general lack of demand. We've heard from several folks that summer fill and fall application programs are actually have been more robust when it comes to anhydrous ammonia, as far as the farmer biting the bullet and purchasing their nitrogen needs for this fall. They've been doing so at a better rate than what everyone thought when a lot of this pricing came out. So that necessarily is not helping the anhydrous ammonia piece of input decisions and input prices, rather, as far as resetting that market. Urea and UAN, however, being more expensive per unit of nitrogen than anhydrous ammonia, those markets have kind of softened up a bit. And they're still more expensive from what we can tell per unit of nitrogen, So there is more room lower, and that's been encouraging. But again, like net, the differences are not big enough to change the economics for corn producers in this country. So
Right. Because when you have something like nitrogen, which is a direct increase to bushels, and when bushels equal margins at the moment, how do you reach that level of low prices curing lower prices when you can't really afford to not have nitrogen?
yes, that's the other thing, right? Is if the solution for a grower is to bushel their way out of low prices, you kind of need nitrogen to do that. So if growers are going to make that decision of, okay, we're going to not put on many pounds of nitrogen per acre this coming year, maybe that leads to lower nitrogen prices, and maybe that leads to higher corn prices in the form of we have less supply because we put on less nitrogen. Like that's what the market should be solving for at the moment. The issue is that, first of all, a change like that, we're talking about probably 12 months for the market to rationalize something like that, right? So like that's not really going to, obviously not impacting the crop that's about to be harvested. Maybe it impacts the crop being planted, in spring 2026 if those ducks fall in a row. So like any planting decision changings really are not going to solve or cure these higher prices anytime soon. But what I will say is like, because of what you mentioned, and obviously well-known fact that nitrogen equals bushels, especially when it comes to corn, we don't see a lot of farmers cutting back too much on nitrogen in the form of anhydrous ammonia. They might switch up the form of nitrogen they use. If they're big on UAN and urea, they might head to anhydrous ammonia because again, it's cheaper per pound of nitrogen. But we're really seeing it in phosphates. So a lot of phosphate application, I think, will be put on in lower rates this fertilizing season, and as it should be, because the cost of phosphates per bushel are really astronomical. And I will also say, should lower phosphate application rates impact prices for next year? Yes, they should if the farmer actually goes through with it. But I will say, like, we have a very hard time in this country controlling phosphate supply. We don't make a lot of phosphates in this country. They come from China, they come from Russia, and they come from Morocco. And all three of those locations are subject to pretty invasive, for lack of a better term, tariff structures. So the main three places where we get our phosphates imported into this country are, being tariffed pretty heavily. So like we can't really solve that supply problem until we have a few different trade policies when it comes to phosphates. But could the prices come down marginally because growers in the US use less of it? Sure. But again, it's just not going to be the kind of relief the farmer needs until we start importing more phosphates to increase supply.
With us right now, we do have Reese Drenth with the Ground Level Dispatch. Reese, we do have a month free trial link in the description below. If folks were to click that and check you guys out for a month, what would be some of the information they get?
Absolutely. What we try to do is send out grain market information twice a day, once very early in the morning and once in the mid-late afternoon. We keep it very short and sweet. We understand everybody's time is of the essence. And also everybody can get bogged down by all the information that's out there with the grain market. So we try to pick what's important for decision-making purposes specifically. And then 2 or 3 times a weekend during the month, we try to send out editorials. This past weekend, I wrote one about some railroad mergers and acquisitions that are being teed up in this country and how that might impact local grain markets and freight markets in general. We write about agronomy input prices once a month at least, and then we try to do a fun one or a product of the month or something too. So give us a try.
Reese Drenth, thank you so much for joining us on Farm Your Daily.
You bet.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I'm your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.